$90 billion. That is the combined profit Pfizer, BioNTech, Moderna, and Sinovac made from COVID-19. Not revenue, profit. Profit from selling a vaccine during a crisis that brought the global healthcare system to its knees. But that number, as staggering as it is just the tip of a very deep iceberg. Every health crisis presents two paths: the path of public good and the path of private profit. This is the story of how, during humanity's greatest modern health crisis, a handful of companies chose profit. Systematically, deliberately, and with the full protection of the law. Let me be clear from the start, this isn't a story about good versus evil. It's not that simple. This story is about systems, incentives, and the predictable outcomes when public health collides with private interests. Back in 2019, Moderna was a relatively unknown company with 0 approved products and annual revenue of just $60 million. Their stock traded at $19. Many investors thought they were on the verge of failure. Then came COVID-19. By 2021, their revenue had exploded to $18 billion. Their stock peaked at $449, turning executives into billionaires overnight. But the technology behind Moderna's vaccine? Funded by taxpayers. The research? Funded by taxpayers. The clinical trials? Funded by taxpayers. The fundamental mRNA technology was developed with public funding over decades. Private companies then patented slight modifications of this public research and claimed it as their own. During the polio epidemic, Dr. Jonas Salk was asked who owned the patent on his vaccine. Jonas simply responded,
"Who owns the patent on this vaccine?"
Well, the people, I would say. There is no patent. Could you patent the sun?
Today, Moderna holds 7 patents on their COVID vaccine. Pfizer holds 5. And they have aggressively defended these patents even as people around the world died waiting for vaccine access. By December 2020, Pfizer had already filed multiple patent applications covering various aspects of their vaccine. These weren't just patents on the vaccine itself, but on the lipid nanoparticles used to deliver it, the manufacturing process, even the vials used to store it. This created what's called a patent thicket. Multiple overlapping patents that make it virtually impossible for others to produce similar products. Controlling who can produce the vaccine meant controlling the competition, and by extension, the market. Through Operation Warp Speed, top pharmaceutical companies received over $18 billion in public funding from taxpayers. They then turned around and charged those same taxpayers huge markups for the vaccine.
Today, only 4 big firms produce 90% of the world's vaccines. So taxpayers have to plug the gap. Companies develop vaccines from publicly funded research and then sell them back to public health systems at high prices to maximize profits, which means taxpayers end up paying twice. It also means that public funding isn't achieving the best public health outcomes.
Pfizer generated an estimated $35 billion in profits from COVID-19 products during 2021 to 22. BioNTech and Moderna each earned around $20 billion. They achieved these extraordinary profits through a complex web of government funding, opaque contracts, and very strategic pricing decisions. The public funding eliminated most of the research and development risks typically used to justify high pharmaceutical prices. Then came the Advanced Purchase Agreements, APAs, contracts worth more than $87 billion that gave companies guaranteed sales before their vaccines were even proven to work. These agreements effectively transferred all risk from the pharmaceutical companies to taxpayers. If the vaccines failed, companies wouldn't have to repay the money. If they succeeded, as they did, companies could keep all the profits despite the massive public investment in their development. A win-win for pharma. Even though the governments committed billions in taxpayer money to pharmaceutical giants through these APAs, the contracts were shrouded in secrecy and heavily redacted when released to the public. Government leaders stood before their citizens making bold promises. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen declared vaccines would be our universal common good, while European leaders such as Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron echoed commitments to vaccines as global public goods. The contracts themselves contained no such guarantees. Instead, they offered pharmaceutical companies billions in upfront payments, legal immunity from vaccine injuries, and permanent ownership of manufacturing facilities, clinical data, and intellectual property built with public money. While the US government secured some rights to data generated through its Moderna contract, the EU failed to negotiate any sharing of IP or technology. Crucial details in these contracts were hidden behind heavy redactions. Pricing, delivery schedules, liability terms, and production requirements were all obscured from public view. This secrecy made it impossible for taxpayers to evaluate whether their government had negotiated fair terms. Some unredacted contracts did leak. Investigative journalists at Italy's broadcaster Rai obtained and published unredacted versions of some of AstraZeneca and Moderna's contracts. The unredacted AstraZeneca contract revealed a controversial clause that allowed the company to determine when the pandemic was over, effectively giving them unilateral power to end their earlier commitment to non-profit pricing. The contracts also exposed the weak delivery guarantees in the EU's agreement with AstraZeneca, which merely require best reasonable efforts to meet schedules, and explicitly stated that delays due to other competing agreements would not constitute a breach of contract. This clause would prove devastating to the EU, as AstraZeneca prioritized its UK deliveries while falling dramatically short of their EU commitments. By early 2021, AstraZeneca had delivered only 30 million of its promised 90 million doses to the EU. In the Moderna agreement, the journalists uncovered that even though EU had paid hundreds of millions in upfront costs to help scale up manufacturing, they failed to secure any rights to the intellectual property or know-how generated through this public investment. It would not be long before the world felt the impact. At the UN General Assembly in September 2020, 16 pharmaceutical companies, including Pfizer and Moderna, pledged to support equitable and affordable distribution globally. But the reality was very different. Most vaccines were sold to high-income countries.
First vaccines against Covid-19 have gone mostly to wealthier countries. Now, several middle-income countries are getting their shots. Many come from Chinese and Russian drug makers. However, critics note that these developers have not been forthcoming with data on their vaccine safety and efficacy.
The pricing was optimized for profit, not equitable distribution. In the United States, Pfizer increased their vaccine price from $19.90 per dose in July 2020 to $30.50 by June 2022. Moderna's prices rose from an initial $16.50 to $26.40 by July 2022. EU prices followed suit. High-income countries like Kuwait paid even higher prices, up to $40 per dose. Meanwhile, the Vaccine Alliance purchased doses for low-income countries at just under $10 each. The result of these pricing strategies was predictable. While wealthy nations secured early access to vaccines at whatever price was demanded, poorer countries were left waiting.
there is serious concern that poorer countries are being left behind in the search for global immunity. Thousands of volunteers from low-income countries in Africa took part in clinical trials of the new vaccines. In spite of that, new research indicates wealthy countries with just 14% of the world's population have bought more than half of the doses of leading vaccines.
The price increases have only just begun. Both Pfizer and Moderna have announced plans to charge up to $130 per dose. The profit machinery was far more sophisticated than simple price markups. Decades of regulatory capture had ensured the system would work in the industry's favor. During the pandemic, Doran Fink served on the FDA's senior leadership team for COVID vaccine review and policy activities, taking part in the ultimate decision to license Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. Fink's LinkedIn profile states that he finished his role at the FDA in December 2022. 2 months later, he was working at Moderna, heading the Translational Medicine and Early Clinical Development Program in infectious diseases. Meanwhile, Jaya Goswami started at the FDA in its Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research in March 2020. She was responsible for evaluating whether the clinical data for Moderna's COVID vaccine met regulatory standards for approval. The license was granted to Moderna at the end of January 2022. Goswami's LinkedIn profile states that she left the FDA in June 2022 and that same month started a new role as Director of Clinical Development in Infectious Diseases at Moderna. But the deeper you look, the more troubling it gets. The FDA receives nearly half its funding from the very pharmaceutical companies it's supposed to regulate. The watchdog meant to protect us relies on the industry it oversees to keep its lights on. By 2022, fees collected from the industry constituted 46% of the FDA's budget. In a 2016 study in the BMJ, researchers examined the job histories of 55 FDA staff who had conducted drug reviews over a 9-year period. They found that 15 of the 26 employees who left the regulatory agency later worked or consulted for the pharmaceutical industry. In addition, 9 out of the last 10 FDA commissioners, representing nearly 4 decades of agency leadership, have gone on to work for pharmaceutical companies. These political connections ensure privileged access, building systematic bias into the very structure of pharmaceutical procurement and regulation. The consequences of this systemic bias extend and corrupt globally. Transparency International published a report in which they identified 135 high-risk UK government contracts worth £15 billion that contained 3 or more corruption red flags. These suspicious contracts represented almost 1/3 of all COVID-19 spending. They uncovered a VIP lane, a fast-track procurement system through which 51 contracts worth £4 billion were awarded to politically connected suppliers. The waste of public funds was astronomical. Billions of pounds worth of protective equipment bought through the VIP lane was deemed not fit for purpose. Prices were inflated by nearly £1 billion, 80% higher than non-VIP suppliers, and the Department of Health ultimately wrote off more than £10 billion worth of goods. Yet, key contracts for large orders remain unpublished or heavily redacted. When journalists attempted to investigate through Freedom of Information requests, they were stonewalled, with the authorities allegedly coordinating the blocking of FOI releases. Perhaps the most concerning example of how deeply corporate interests have infiltrated our public health system is the case of Gilead Remdesivir, a promising drug that we, the public, helped create through our tax dollars. $76 million of public money went into its development. Yet Gilead applied for something called an orphan drug designation, a special status meant for drugs that treat rare diseases. This designation would give Gilead a golden ticket, 7 years where no one else could make the drug, plus some hefty tax breaks. When public outrage forced Gilead to back down from their orphan drug request, they still went on to charge $3,120 for a 5-day treatment of remdesivir, a drug that costs less than $1 a day to make. They did this despite the drug showing minimal benefits.
Now, hopes the antiviral drug remdesivir could treat COVID-19 have been dashed after it failed a clinical trial. According to draft documents published by the World Health Organization, patients taking the drug did not improve. It also did not reduce the amount of the virus found in their bloodstreams.
All while using public money, public research, and public guarantees. The financial windfall began before vaccines even gained approval. The pandemic created unprecedented personal wealth for shareholders, executives, and insiders. Both BioNTech's and Moderna's CEOs, Or Shaheen and Stéphane Bancel, became billionaires during the crisis. Between January 2020 and February 2022, Bancel alone sold approximately $408 million worth of Moderna shares. Pfizer CEO Albert Bourla received a pay package worth over $24 million in 2021, comprised of his salary of $1.7 million, stock options, and a bonus $8 million, which the company justified as reflecting his exceptional performance and leadership. However, something far more valuable was quietly being accumulated in the background: data. The global COVID-19 vaccination campaign became the largest pharmaceutical data gathering exercise in human history. This wasn't just data about vaccine effectiveness. It included information about side effects, breakthrough infections, and immune system reactions across diverse populations. Information that would typically take decades to gather was collected in months. This data, gathered through publicly funded vaccination programs, had immense commercial value beyond the immediate pandemic response. The insights gained from mass vaccination programs could inform future drug development and medical research. The scale was unprecedented. While typical clinical trials involve thousands of participants, the COVID-19 vaccination campaign provided data from billions of people worldwide. And the APAs enabled pharma giants to claim this data as their own. Even though this data was collected through public health systems, using government databases, and facilitated by taxpayer-funded healthcare workers. This may be the pandemic's most valuable and least understood legacy. The data gathered could shape medical research and drug development for years to come. Or it could earn pharma giants more money than they ever dreamed of. What few people realize is how COVID-19 fundamentally transformed the pharmaceutical industry's approach to clinical trials. Before the pandemic, bringing a vaccine to market typically took 10 to 15 years. Operation Warp Speed changed everything. By running trials in parallel rather than sequence, compressing timelines, and pouring unprecedented resources into development, the industry proved it could move much faster than previously claimed. If pharmaceutical companies can develop safe, effective vaccines in less than a year during a crisis, why do they insist on decade-long development cycles for other life-saving medicines? The answer, of course, is profit. Longer development times mean longer patent protection and higher profits. COVID-19 accidentally revealed the industry's capacity for rapid development when properly motivated and funded. Traditional drug development keeps manufacturing small until after approval, supposedly to manage financial risk. But COVID-19 exposed this as a choice, not a necessity. When governments removed financial risk through advanced purchase agreements, companies quickly scaled up manufacturing during development. This means every time a promising drug sits in a small-scale production while companies claim they must proceed cautiously, it's a business decision, not a scientific necessity. Every time development is stretched out over a decade or more, it's about patents and profits, not safety or science. The structures and systems that enabled corruption, manipulation, and rampant profiteering during the pandemic remain firmly in place. The pharmaceutical industry continues to prioritize profit over global health equity. New patents are being filed for variants and boosters. Pricing strategies for endemic COVID are being developed. Government procurement systems remain vulnerable to corruption and cronyism. And the gap between rich and poor nations and access to medical resources has, if anything, widened. The next pandemic is not a question of if, but when. And when it comes, will we have learned from failures of the past, or will we let history repeat itself? The system didn't fail us. The system worked exactly as designed.